The Bitcoin attention, the eyeballs on crypto, it's currently a disaster. When you look at YouTube channels, right, this is an interesting statistics here. You look at various crypto YouTubers, their subscriber numbers, their growth is pretty much at zero. And this is bad for channels like this one, of course, right? It's kind of tough as a YouTuber to still continue making content when there's no growth. That being said, when there is a crisis, there's always also opportunity. And it does make a lot of sense to buy when nobody else is looking. So look at this, right? This is first the Bitcoin chart just in US dollars, but we're going to look at this relative to tech stocks. This is the US dollar chart with the best moving average that has been backtested. So feel free to check out another video on this channel where I backtest several moving averages. But what's interesting about this chart is how we're pretty much now going sideways after the FTX collapse, right? So there is no real appreciation here anymore, but there's also no further downfall after the FTX collapse. This kind of dynamic is very different to what other traditional assets are currently doing. When you look at the Nasdaq is dropping quite massively, right? When you look at the S&P 500, it's the same. When you look at property prices, it's the same. Traditional assets are currently going down. Bitcoin can stay somewhat at its level. Now you see over here this vertical line, right? This is the 21st of November, 2022. Now, why did I put this line over here? The Nasdaq, since this line has dropped roughly 7%, it's because that's the day when Bitcoin started to appreciate versus the Nasdaq. So this is a chart you probably haven't yet seen. So this is Bitcoin relative to the Nasdaq. So the Bitcoin price divided by the Nasdaq. And this is since the 21st of November going up. So Bitcoin, because it's not falling as opposed to traditional finance, is actually appreciating 15% so far. So this is not bad. Of course, we have this incredible crash due to FTX. And in case we do see another major collapse from whatever it is, right? See if it's Binance, if it's Tether, or let's say it's Grayscale, right? If we do get news out there that push this again down, of course, this relative valuation will go down as well. But just from this chart here, right, we can see if nothing happens, the Bitcoin holders seem to simply hold tight. They're not really selling. And traditional finance is actually having currently the crisis. So the reason why Bitcoin isn't appreciating is simply because there's so much pressure from the outside world, from the macro economy. Now let's zoom out here a little bit. Let's look again at Bitcoin relative to the Nasdaq, but this time let's look at the weekly chart. Let's look at a longer term chart and let's zoom out as far as we can. So this is August of 2021. And this is, of course, just an imaginary line, right? The support line. But still, I think it's interesting to see that since 2017, where we had here the ICO boom, then the bust, then the Corona crash over here, and now the recent bear market, how we have been bottoming out along this line, right? We could easily go below this line, nobody knows. But still, I found an interesting thing, simply just to get a reference point of where we currently are. If you were to draw, say, a horizontal level here, right? Maybe let's get the intra-week chart and let's take the really bearish case, right? The low point during Corona and then the lower prices in 2018, 2019. If we were to go to a similar low level, we would still see a relative underperformance of Bitcoin of roughly 66%. Now, I don't see this happening. I still just want to present the very bearish case. The reason why I don't see this happening is because when you look at other metrics, such as the on-chain metrics, we are already very, very depressed. And we still see that long-term holders aren't selling. And we also see all-time highs in terms of number of wallets that are at around 1 Bitcoin. So Bitcoin currently is very, very widely spread among retail, much more than in the past. Which tells me when there's more people that are invested in this, more small guys invested in this, that's also more likely to stabilize at a higher price than it has in the past. I do not see this kind of a crash happening from here, but I simply wanted to show this possible scenario, right? Nothing is impossible. It's possible scenario as well. I personally continue dollar cost averaging, and I dollar cost average relatively heavily right now, simply because we are pretty depressed and also because of the upcoming charts that I'm gonna share here. So let's look at this. This is the realized HODL ratio. So what's that? It's basically measuring how much is short-term speculation, as in holding within 1 week, happening relative to medium-term speculation, meaning holding between 1 and 2 years. Okay, so 1 week versus 1 to 2 years. And the reason why I want to put this into relation to one another is to simply see how much excitement is there currently. And that was the intro of this video, right? The attention on Bitcoin is low. And this is one of the metrics, a bit more professional than just YouTube followers, that looks at how much active speculation is happening, how much attention is happening, right? When there's a lot of attention, there's also a lot of speculation. And we see how this is topping out in similar ranges, right, during bull markets, and how this is also bottoming during bear markets in similar ranges. And currently we are very, very cheap. We have been slightly cheaper in the past. In 2015, this was after Mt. Gox and Silk Road collapsed, but the 2018 bottom was higher, and now we are pretty much at that level. So there's really not a lot of hype, not a lot of heat, anything like this in the crypto space. If you're currently buying, you're definitely somebody that's doing something non-conventional, right? You're doing something that's against the grain, and that's usually how you make money, right? You make money by being right when other people are wrong, right? You don't want to just follow the masses, at least on these very long-term scales. There's another interesting chart, and that's the market value to realized value Z-score. So the main point here is, where is the current price, the current realized price of the people that bought Bitcoin for? In other words, is now the market in aggregate in gains, in winnings, or are they currently at losses? And the reason why this is interesting is, when the market in aggregate is currently in the profits, right? When it's positive momentum and everybody has a green in their portfolio, then there's more chance to potentially see sell pressure because people want to take profits. However, when you've got an asset such as Bitcoin that tends to inflate less than fiat currencies, then when you are at a temporary loss, right, you might not be as inclined to sell. If you're a very short-term speculator, of course, you might be selling if you don't believe in Bitcoin over the long term. But there is a pretty strong basis of long-term believers that simply just wait for a new all-time high to occur, which is very likely just a matter of time. No financial advice, right? But in my opinion, it's just a matter of time, because inflation rate of fiat is way, way higher. So we simply just need more and more capital flowing back in once capital becomes looser again. Now there's monetary tightening. It's hard to get credit. All assets go down. This all also weighs, of course, on Bitcoin as well. But when this turns around, and at some point it very likely will, then Bitcoin will very likely, in my opinion, be an outperformer versus traditional assets because of its inherent leverage, because of its high volatility. So what happens is, people that are in losses, they simply just hold on. They tend to hold on. And so when we look at the cycles again, right, very long-term chart, we see it tends to bottom in similar areas. Does it mean that Bitcoin can't go lower from here? Of course, it does not. And why does it not mean that? Because we don't know how long the tightening will continue. Inflation rates are still high. They are now being artificially suppressed in the US. That's why we are only at like 5.5% inflation there. It's because the US is currently selling its oil reserves. In other parts of the world, we have inflation rates of north to 15, sometimes 20%. And that's when you don't have those oil reserves to sell. So these high inflation rates put pressure on the Federal Reserve, or on central banks in general, to raise interest rates. And rising interest rates is bad for risk on assets. So I'm not saying this has to directly turn around, but what I am saying is that Bitcoin now, at least in the historical context, appears to be cheap. And if you're currently buying, you're definitely doing something contrarian. And the contrarians that buy when nobody else wants to buy, they're the ones that win. And I was one of those people in the 2018 bear market, right? I started dollar cost averaging in at around 6,500 when we crashed from 20K. I started dollar cost averaging in at around 6,500, then bought more at 3,500, continued buying, and then with the bull run that subsequently followed, that's where I then made quite some gains. Okay. Here's one more chart, and this is the HODL waves, and this is what I was already talking about quite a bit earlier in the video. It's how strong are the long-term holders holding onto their Bitcoin? Are they losing conviction, right? Because that's in the end what matters. If the hardcore believers in Bitcoin keep holding, then we simply just have a floor at some point, right? If they keep holding and if they keep dollar cost averaging as well, then at some point, the short-term tourists that are selling, that are panicking right now, they will be flushed out of the market, and we see a bottom, and we see not so much sell pressure on Bitcoin anymore, right? We see it stabilizing at a certain price, whereas the rest of the economy is going down. That's what we currently see. And so when we look at this, we can actually split this up in different layers. So first of all, let's look at the Bitcoin that has not moved from their wallet for at least 10 years. Okay, that's this purple curve over here, right? Before it's at zero because Bitcoin wasn't in existence for 10 years yet. But then we see these kinds of wallets haven't moved their Bitcoin for 10 years. And I think it's very likely actually that these wallets, they probably have lost their private key, right? This is probably for the most part simply just lost Bitcoin. So we can see like 13.7% of all of Bitcoin seems to have been already lost. It looks like this is a constantly increasing function, which is good, right? More and more Bitcoin, relatively speaking, is exiting the market because it's simply lost. Now let's expand this and let's look at all the Bitcoin that's at least 7 years without any movement. And this is increasing that line, right? Now we are in total at 20%. And we can also see how this is constantly going up, right? So the wallets that have held Bitcoin for at least 7 years in aggregate tend to not sell off independent of the cycle, right? This tends to increase. So I'd argue that it's very likely that this will not go down in the future, that 20% even of Bitcoin has probably been lost. Now, let's go to the 5 to 7 year. Okay, so the wallets that haven't moved any Bitcoin for at least 5 years. Now here we see a slight difference already. Here we see sometimes small movements to the downside. Okay, so there are wallets that have held Bitcoin for 5 years that maybe in the 6th year decide to sell. And we can see a little blip over here. You can also see a little blip over here where this has been sold off. But still, as a general trend, I'd still say the people that hold Bitcoin for at least 5 years, they are very, very long-term convinced that Bitcoin is a good asset, or they have lost their Bitcoin. So it's unlikely that these kinds of Bitcoin are going to get sold into the market anytime soon, right? The number of wallets, or the number of Bitcoin rather, continues to increase. And here we are looking at almost 30% already. Okay, so almost 30% of Bitcoin is in very strong hands, either in locked up hands or in diamond hands that very, very rarely sell. Let's expand this, and this is now where we first get some cycles in here. 3 to 5 years. Okay, so now we add the wallets that have held Bitcoin for at least 3 years, and those are now the people that ride the cycles. Those are the people that dollar cost average in and that tend to sell when prices of Bitcoin rise high levels. So this is going up, right? People are dollar cost averaging in, and then Bitcoin had this massive run from like 3K to 20K, and this is where this smart money was selling off, okay? So this is where we don't see necessarily just an increase, but we do see how this kind of smart medium-term speculative money is selling out. Still, quite interesting, right? This is now at an all-time high almost. And what we can see, let me actually add here a few more of those. Right? What we can see is a similar picture. This is now all the Bitcoin that had been held for at least 1 year, okay? So Not the very short-term speculative money that has moved their Bitcoin within a year, but everything at least 1 year. And what we notice with this chart is, of course, we have now way more moves, right? Way more waves here. What we can notice is when this is very, very high, a lot of the Bitcoin is held by wallets that tend to not actively speculate. It's held by wallets that hold it for at least 1 year. It's held by wallets that try to ride the waves to a certain degree. That means when this is very high, these kinds of wallets simply just wait for new all-time highs to come. So in other words, Bitcoin itself is pretty rare, or is pretty, the order books are pretty slim. It's not very liquid. They're simply just held in the wallets. So whenever new entrants enter the space, it can push up the price quite a bit. And when that then happens, right, when Bitcoin isn't flowing around as freely, that's then when the next bull run can happen, right? Look at this. This is over 60%, right? Held by at least 1 year wallets. Once this was at these very, very high levels, that's then when the rally could occur. When this is relatively low, then Bitcoin is flowing around very freely, meaning there is a lot of speculation in the market. That's then when the price can collapse. And we see here, again, an all-time high in this percentage of 1 year wallets. Bitcoin was very, very tight. We see it then rallied from 10K to those 60K, 60 to 17K. And now at the current level, we are again at an all-time high, meaning Bitcoin is one more time very, very tight. It's not being traded very actively. There's not a lot of eyeballs on Bitcoin. It's simply just held by the somewhat diamond hands, right? By the people that hold it for at least 1 year. This is a good thing. This does not mean that Bitcoin will now appreciate instantly afterwards, but it does mean that the preconditions are set up. It's set up in a way that whoever enters the space now is going to move the price, is going to impact the price quite a bit. So even the people that are now dollar cost averaging, they are also more likely to create a floor than when Bitcoin is very liquid, right? Because you can push up the price more. So the current setup is positive. The only thing that we now need is some kind of a tailwind, right? We need the macro picture in total to improve. And if that improvement happens, then I do see Bitcoin rallying again. Until this happens, though, I see Bitcoin rather staying somewhat flat, given that there's no new great implosion in the space happening, right? When everything stays stable, Tether stays around, Binance stays around, etc., then I do see Bitcoin staying flat. The macro picture might push traditional stocks, etc., further down. Bitcoin relative to, for example, the Nasdaq will continue to appreciate. And then at some point, when traditional finance has also bottomed, that's then when Bitcoin can go to its next massive rally. That's then when maybe the 100K might even be on the cards. So that's my picture of how currently things look. It's obviously not nice for influencers not to get a lot of new subscribers, right? This channel is no different. If you haven't yet subscribed, though, feel free to do that, and feel free to share this video also with other friends, right? Even though Bitcoin might not be very fashionable right now, it's probably rather a good time to buy in this market than, you know, to buy when everybody is hyped about it. So feel free to share. And if you haven't yet liked the video, of course, that's also appreciated for the algorithm. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video. Bye-bye.